afternoon, and welcome to our Center for American Studies September 11th, 20th anniversary commemoration today. We are very lucky to have two outstanding speakers with us who will share their experiences in Iraq and elsewhere. And you really can't get this information anywhere else. And besides being highly informative, I can promise some great entertainment as well today. My name is Elizabeth Copperbush. I'm director of the Center for American Studies here at Christopher Newport. Our center is dedicated to teaching America's founding principles in history, economic foundations, and national security. Of course, many of you know because you're in the classes, we have American Studies as well as national security programs, majors and minors. And we would love to tell you more about that outside of this event. But in the meantime, let's focus on today, and I'd like to introduce our speakers. First of all, we have Dr. John Agresto with us today. Professor Agresto is the former president of St. John's College. It's a great little Great Books program in Santa Fe, New Mexico, and there's also one up north, I understand. John has taught at the University of Toronto, Kenyon College, Duke University, and the New School. He has written in the area of politics, law, and education for the Washington Post, Washington Times, Academic Questions, and History of American Political Thought, among others. He's also author of the book Mugged by Reality, which is the title for today's event, and was based on his experiences in Iraq. He formerly served as senior advisor to the Iraqi Ministry of Higher Education and Scientific Research of the Coalition Provisional Authority. Say that 10 times fast. You know they're important when their administrative post takes at least 2 lines of print. He is also the former provost and chancellor of American University of Iraq-Sulaimani. With him today is Dr. James Harrigan, the senior editor at the American Institute for Economic Research and the F.A. Hayek Distinguished Fellow at the Foundation for Economic Education, an equally long title here. He also is co-host of the Words and Numbers podcast, which if you're not familiar with, again, you'll see today is highly entertaining and informative. He was formerly managing director of the Center for Philosophy of Freedom at the University of Arizona and dean of the American University of Iraq-Sulaimani and director of economic programs at the Institute for Humane Studies and Strata, where he was also senior research fellow. He's written extensively for the popular press with articles appearing in Wall Street Journal, USA Today, US News and World Report. Actually, some of my favorite publications of his are reviews of hotels and airlines. You should Google him and look it up. Guarantee you'll enjoy. So I'm going to hand it over, first of all, to Professor Agresto, and please join me in welcoming our guests.
Thank you, Liz. Thanks for a nice introduction. Even if you did put me on an equal par with my colleague, James Harrigan. I just want to start by reading something. She said, I wrote a book called Mugged by Reality, and I want to read you to begin with just a few paragraphs. It's part of a chapter, and the part is called Blowing Up the Challenger. I once had occasion to have breakfast with the dean of a college at one of the major Iraqi universities. It was Dean of the College of Women Dean of the College of Science for Women in Baghdad is what it was. We had met a few times before, though never before had gotten past the handshake and pleasantry stage. An amiable person in his own gruff way, no one would jump to call him terribly intelligent or even thoughtful. Yet what he lacked in intelligence, he made up for in cynicism, though he would be the first to call himself a realist and not a cynic. Tell me, he asked at one point, you're an educated American. Do you really think Arabs crashed those planes into the Twin Towers? Yes, I replied, don't you? Absolutely not, couldn't be. Arabs can't fly planes like that. He's an Arab himself. I had heard this silliness about Arabs and their inability to do anything remotely complicated before. It's a Middle Eastern way of being self-effacing in order to make a larger point or put the blame on others. But what of the 19 Arabs who were on the planes? What were they up to? That's me, I asked. I heard they were going to a wedding, he said. The fact that the planes were all scheduled to go to different American cities didn't matter. It was a rumor, and therefore, as my translator Hassan might have said, being a rumor, it had to be true. Well, then, who did fly the planes? Of course, I thought he'd surprise me and say the Jews. Surprised, since anti-Semitism is not part of the mentality of most professional Iraqis, though it's a strong part of the makeup of religious fanatics, as I would soon discover. Who flew the planes? Americans, he answered. You flew the planes into the buildings yourselves. Why would we do that? In order to blame us and come here and get our oil. I explained that if oil is what we wanted, we could have bought all the oil in Iraq for the next 20 years for what we were spending just trying to get rid of Saddam. We would have cut a deal with Saddam that would have made us happy, him secure, and gas cheap. He thought about that for a second or two, and then he delivered a second, stronger fallback position. From what I understand, you cannot have blacks for slaves anymore in America. Your Supreme Court won't let you. But I think you could have Arabs for slaves, and I think you flew the planes into the buildings to blame it on the Arabs, so you could come here and take Arabs to be slaves in your houses. I'm not sure exactly what I said in response, but it included the notion that Americans are neither interested in Arabs as slaves, nor especially in killing our fellow citizens for that purpose. At this, he brightened up at the thought of my naivete. Of course you would kill each other to get slaves. I know you had a civil war with each other because many of you wanted to have slaves. Of course you'd kill each other for slaves. But put that aside, maybe you crashed the planes into the buildings for the sake of science, for the sake of the advancement of learning. Now, I'm sure my face was a total blank at this point. Science? He says, yes. Like when your great President Reagan blew up the Challenger in order to see what would happen scientifically. You remember he gave that speech where he praised the astronauts for having sacrificed so much for the sake of science and for the progress of science. Joking as I probably was on my tea at that point, my response probably sounded more indignant than rational, and no doubt reconfirmed his belief that there's no motivation other than self-interest at work in human affairs, whether it be from low motives, oil or slaves, or from higher ones, progress of national science. All humans and all nations act from reasons of self-interest, nothing less, nothing more. Only a dumb American would think otherwise. So that sort of leads into what I want to talk about today, building around the idea of foreign policy and self-interest. I want to talk about building democracy. I want to talk about promoting freedom. I want to talk about the problem of religion. I want to talk about the varieties of self-interest. I want to talk about the roots of patriotism, the force of culture, and the deep complexity of human nature. And I'm going to do it all in 20 minutes, so don't fall asleep. Let me begin with self-interest in general. Why did we go to Iraq or Afghanistan? On the left in America, people often have an economic motive for human activity. For instance, we've all heard, we went to Iraq for oil. Now, we hear that, at least I know we hear that from people on the left, like Michael Moore, and people on the supposed right, like President Trump. He said the same thing. That's why we went to Iraq. I take it to be a natural law that anything that both Michael Moore and Donald Trump agree on is false. You like that, didn't you? Now, the right also sees, sometimes sees economics as determinative, but sometimes it could be love of other things, love of conquest or overcoming the other. It's often a cultural or a power politics motivation. Now, both left and right agree that self-interest is ruling in one form or another. The Iraqi dean thought it, and I think many, if not most Americans, think it too. But in either Iraq or Afghanistan, was self-interest all that was motivating? Was that all that it was? Afghanistan is perhaps the easier case study. Bin Laden and his followers killed about 3,000 of us and destroyed not only 2 buildings, but destroyed our easy way of life, probably forever. The Taliban in Afghanistan sheltered him, wouldn't give him up. Justice demanded retribution, and our self-interest demanded we keep it from ever happening again. So yes, it was self-interest, but an odd kind of self-interest when you look at the different parts. To volunteer to fight, to volunteer to be a soldier in the Afghanistan campaign was to risk death in a war to save your neighbors. Very American and not easily explained by naked brute self-interest. I'm reminded when I was in Iraq, there were car bombings all the time, suicide bombings. And whenever a bomb went off, whether it was at a building or very often they used them to attack school buses full of children or hospitals. Whenever a bomb went off, the immediate thing the Iraqis would do was to run. They would run from the blast. It's only natural. You want to get away from the bomber. The American soldiers would run towards the blast. Very different idea of what you're supposed to do and what your interest demands. We would run towards the blast. I just found that so telling. Not what naked self-interest would demand you do. Was self-interest there? Where's the self-interest involved in putting your life on the line for others? Now that's what we did in both Iraq and Afghanistan for either the Iraqis or for the future of Americans. But what about those who flew the planes? Let's talk about self-interest there. If self-interest is all, what was their self-interest? Not money, not power, but I think fairly clearly they had an interest in ideology, or not to put too fine a point on it, they had an interest in doing what God, they thought, wanted them to do. It's funny, going back to when I was a kid, we used to think that communism was so fearsome and communism would destroy our way of life because they were godless. Godless people will do anything. They have no morals. But godless people have an interest. And an interest is, since there's no afterlife, an interest in this life. You could deal with godless people. Terrorists are God-fearing, and in some ways, that makes it impossible to deal with them. Their interest is not in this world. So, number one, we have to stop thinking of ordinary self-interest as the engine of human activity. Sometimes people will die for an interest that we barely can understand. But if we don't understand it, we can't begin to guard against it. Okay, let's put the idea of self-interest aside for now and come back to it later. What about the idea of democracy? Maybe we went to Afghanistan and Iraq, as we hear a lot, to bring democracy. Now, bringing democracy may mean different things to different people. I went over not to help set up government, but to help set up schools and colleges. Others went to start hospitals, to get clean water flowing. In Afghanistan, soldiers went, people from the State Department went to help women, minorities. In Iraq, to put an end to Saddam's torture of ordinary people, decimation of the Kurds. We went to stop the mass graves from ever occurring again there. In Afghanistan, it was President and Mrs. Bush's highest desire to start a university that for the first time in the history of that country would teach women equally with men. We who went when we were asked didn't go to make money or get oil for ExxonMobil, wouldn't even go to find weapons of mass destruction. We saw as our goal setting up civil society. professional associations, newspapers, schools and colleges, an independent judicial system, hospitals, chambers of commerce, all the things that precede setting up a democracy, or indeed precede setting up any decent form of modern government. But bringing democracy, and not just civil society, to both Iraq and Afghanistan was high on the agenda, not of those of us who went as much as those of us who sent us. And as we saw all too late, they had almost no idea what democracy entailed. Get rid of the dictator, set up elections, and voila, democracy. How pathetically simple-minded. Leaders of both our parties had Pollyanna-ish views about what democracy was, what it entails, what its limitations are, and what kills it. Too many in government thought, democracy is easy. Anybody can put it together and everybody wants it. And none of that is true. Setting up a tyranny is easy. Autocracies are fairly simple. But setting up a decent, moderate, and free democracy is extremely hard. Perhaps the hardest thing to do in all of politics. Talk political science talk for a minute. The powers that be, the political powers, had it in their mind that democracy meant seeing to it that all groups got represented. Somehow they got into their head that democracy is the representation of groups. Shia groups, Sunni fanatics, Iranian partisans. They thought that representing interest groups was the democratic way. And we never could figure out, they never could figure out, why the government that was chosen was always extreme and why nothing could get done beyond fighting. How differently it was when we set up our democracy. Ms. Bush mentioned that there's a respect for the American Constitution and the American founders. And I just want you to see what they did and that we've forgotten how to do. Consider the following. It must seem strange to the modern proponents of democracy, this is again from the book, to look at the American founding and see, for example, people elected on the basis of geography rather than interest or sex, SECTS. The founders could have easily put together a legislative branch that proportionately represented our various and strongly held confessions, with so many seats for Anglicans or Congregationalists or for Catholics and so on. Or perhaps they could have divided seats up on the basis of occupations. So many merchants, fishermen, bankers, farmers, but no. They thought best to have people vote in electoral districts to represent area, geography, and where to get elected, each candidate has to appeal to a wide variety of interests. In so doing, if the districts were varied enough, the person most electable was a person who might have some cross-factional appeal, a person who might not be the exact exponent of your particular interest or view, but who might well be acceptable, perhaps seem fair enough, across a wide rather than narrow spectrum. And you, the voter, would in turn have to dampen your expectation of achieving all you desired in order to have your vote succeed. In this way, American democracy tried both to moderate the passions of elected leaders as well as the passions over time of the people as well. How different a view of democracy this is from one that underscores factionalism and that emphasizes and empowers division. And what we did in Iraq was to take every group and empower them. An insane thing to do, at least to those who want to see moderate and fair democracies. One more political science notion. Perhaps today we think, and I think we do think, that democracy is an end in itself. Perhaps we think all nations should be democratic. That's the goal, to spread democracy around the world. But we forget that in history, there are good democracies and bad democracies. What makes a democracy good? Freedom, peace, promotion of prosperity, security, promotion of justice, perhaps even the promotion of friendship among citizens. Like the preamble to the Constitution says, it doesn't say we're having this Constitution to promote democracy. We're having this Constitution to promote a more perfect union, to establish justice, to ensure domestic tranquility, to provide for the common defense, to promote the general welfare, and to secure the blessings of liberty. A democracy is good if it can promote these, and not one of those ends, and those are true ends, aims, not one is easy. Take liberty. Don't all people want to be free? George W. Bush would say that. And I think that's actually silliness. Not all people want to be free. Some people would rather be told what to do than think or work for themselves. Some people only want to obey God's commands. They don't want to be free. They want to be obedient. Some people are more attached to family or tribe or region than to freedom. And especially after decades of Ba'ath Party socialism, being taken care of surely sounded safer and more desirable than going off on your own. Do all men wish to be free? No. But the truth is, the question, do all men wish to be free, isn't even the right question. The right question you want to ask if you want to set up a free society, you want to help that cultivate that, is not, do you want to be free, but do you want your neighbor to be free? And if the answer is no, my neighbor believes in false gods and is going to send us all to hell. My neighbor is corrupting my children. My neighbor cannot be free. My neighbor has to be stifled. If you say that, you will never set up a free democracy. Let me connect this notion of liberty to where I began, national self-interest. Why did we think, and we certainly did think, that setting up this democracy was in our national interest? And there's a part of political science that teaches, and this is partly, I would think partly true. Liberal democracies fight communist countries, fight fascist countries, fight slave power, fight tyrannies and autocracies around the world sometimes. Liberal democracies never, or at least almost never, fight each other. It's almost impossible to imagine that tomorrow you will wake up and we will have dropped bombs on France. Not going to happen. No matter how mad we might get at them, we're never going to fight a war with them. Never could imagine that Australia will drop bombs on Italy. It's not going to happen. Liberal democracies tend not to fight one another. The old rule was no two countries that each have a McDonald's will ever go to war. I don't know if it's absolutely true, but it seems to have been borne out somewhat in history. Still, even if that's true, did we know how to put together a liberal democracy in Iraq or Afghanistan? We did not know how. Concentrating on establishing a democracy in both Iraq and Afghanistan, combined with not knowing beans about how to establish democracy for ordered freedom and for peace in a non-democratic country, is bound to fail. But you may say, didn't it succeed in Kurdish Iraq? And I think it did, at least in large measure. Why? In Kurdish Iraq, as opposed to Arab Iraq, there was cohesiveness. There was an already blatant love of freedom. There was an interest, a real interest in capitalism and in getting ahead. There was an interest in wanting their neighbors who were of their tribe, so to speak, to be free. There was moderated religion. There was a Muslim culture. Yes, of course, a Muslim culture. They were all Muslims by and large. But culture was for festivals, not for fighting. It's almost as if the Kurds were a democratic people before they established a democratic government. And if you think about it, that's almost the history of America that way too. We could do nothing to save the universities. We did establish a liberal arts university in Kurdistan. In fact, I even have a notepad from the one that James and I put together. But we could do nothing to save the universities in southern Iraq. Consider this. Dozens of professors were killed in the 9 months I was working in southern Iraq with them. And hundreds were later killed. Hundreds of professors were later killed. Why? Political reasons. They were of the wrong political party. Some were Baptists, but mostly the wrong religion. And all, literally all, I know of no exception to this, all professors were killed by their students. I'm not asking you to take a lesson from this. Why did the students care? They lived under a tyranny for 30 years, and I think this explanation holds some water. They had scant notions of freedom. Their public life was a mixture of totalitarianism and socialism in politics, and feudalism and social hierarchy in private life. And that gave structure to their life. Now the only structure left was religion. And now the enemy was not exactly America or Iran or the Turks or Israel, but fellow Iraqis who were members of the other sect. We unleashed the darkest parts of the human soul and human nature when we liberated some people from Saddam. Modernity meant nothing to them. Liberty and prosperity meant nothing. Doing God's will and going to heaven meant everything. This is, to them, true self-interest. It's what motivated the people who flew the planes into the Twin Towers. It was behind the bombing of every children's school bus and all the beheadings. It fueled the rise of ISIS in Iraq, behind the return of Al-Qaeda and the Taliban and ISIS and the Haqqani network now in Afghanistan. And to think that President Bush could ask with a straight face, don't all religions seek peace? No. Some do, maybe most. I do believe most. But all, no. And you can't get away with saying that that the murderous beliefs are cults or sects and not part of real religion. That's just no help. It just shows the speaker's limited view of history, even the history of religious wars here in the West. They were really ferocious. Let me put the summary on this. We didn't, or at least our political leaders in the international community, didn't understand politics, didn't understand the preconditions of democracy, didn't understand the nature of fanatical religion, didn't understand the desires of the human soul, didn't understand the complexity of human nature, and didn't understand the interplay between basic human nature and culture. The saddest part is that we did have some real success. We supported the Kurds in their desire to be free and tolerant, and we did set up schools, colleges, hospitals, some real freedom of the press, some real liberation of women, some real independence of thought in Afghanistan. But then we abandoned the Kurds where they were being slaughtered in Syria and beleaguered by the Turks, and we abandoned all those who trusted in us in Afghanistan, abandoned them in a shameful and inhuman way. For 20 years, we helped build a decent civil society in Afghanistan. For the last 20 years, we lost fewer American soldiers in Afghanistan than we lose in 2 days to COVID here at home. And then we left our Afghani colleagues who bore the brunt of fighting for 20 years to die. And all this for a misunderstanding of what our true self-interest really is. Did we stop an endless war? No, we stopped only 20 years, almost 20 years of peace for ourselves. And we betrayed our friends. Are we safer? I'm afraid not. A war doesn't end just because we say it did or hope it did. Nope, the terrorists will be back, emboldened by our surrender. They will sell our armaments and technology to China, Russia, and North Korea. And even if they don't, they'll be supported by those nations against our interests. They will gain hundreds of thousands, literally hundreds of thousands of new recruits who will fight for the final victory against democracy and modernity and what they see as the degrading excess of freedom in the West. And now what will we do? Perhaps we should take to heart what Churchill was reputed to have said to Chamberlain, the British Prime Minister, when Chamberlain handed Czechoslovakia to Hitler in hopes of securing peace. You were given the choice between war and dishonor. You chose dishonor. You will have war. Please, students, study history, study political science, study democratic theory, study comparative religions, study psychology that really teaches you to see what human motivations might be. Take Jefferson and Madison and Hamilton and Lincoln and de Tocqueville seriously. They knew what was needed to build a free and secure democratic government. Above all, don't put your faith in platitudes or in slogans or in pat answers. When you're told something like all religions preach peace, question it. When you hear that everyone wants to be free, think about it hard. Slogans are no substitute for thoughts. Fortune cookies, no substitute for books. When you're told that we should spread democracy, go into the matter more deeply. If you're tempted to say that all human motivation stems from self-interest or materialism or a will to power, see if those simple explanations fit the circumstances. We failed in Iraq and Afghanistan, not from a lack of goodwill. Every American I met in Iraq was there to help and meant it. But they didn't all know how. They may have known about telecommunications or agriculture or medicine, whatever, but they, and especially their leaders of both parties, didn't have much of a clue about the most important things. Not much of a clue about democracy, freedom, justice, religion, the psychology of terrorism, the interplay of culture and human nature. John Wayne was reputed to have said, life's hard, but it's harder if you're stupid. Well, none of us are stupid, but we may not well be yet well educated. And this country needs nothing more than well-educated leaders and educated citizens, and educated about the most important human and civic political things. Getting a good education in these matters is actually the most patriotic thing you can do. I know that every address should have a happy or at least uplifting ending. I'm afraid I may have failed to. Now maybe Professor Harrigan will turn this around. I doubt it, but who knows? Thank you.
I actually will turn this around because you kind of have to. We can't walk out this morbid a thought. I would normally say it's nice to see all of your faces here today, but of course I can't see any of your faces. So it goes, life in the times of COVID. My Iraq story begins a long time ago. It begins on my birthday of all days. I was alone up at Storrs, Connecticut. I was a student there at the University of Connecticut. And I was laying on my bed watching TV on January the 16th. And that's when the first Gulf War broke out. And we all kind of watched this unfold. I'd never really considered Iraq in any meaningful way prior to that. And really, I didn't consider Iraq in any meaningful way until many years later, when I had occasion to send John here an email. And the first part of this is almost like a testament. So think about it in the spirit in which I offer it. In your life, you're going to have certain moments that actually change the trajectory that you're on. And my life utterly changed when I sent John a simple email responding to an ad in an academic circulation, looking for professors in Iraq. So I wrote to him. I said, yep, that sounds like me. Let's do this. And he wrote back almost immediately saying, yeah, I don't think so. We've got too many political scientists. Go away. It's exactly what happened. Don't even look at him. It's like a forked-tongued devil. Anyway, a month or two later, he writes and he says, still interested? If so, meet me in DC. And I said, okay. And I drove out to DC and we sat and had a very nice conversation. One of the all-time great ones, actually, the best job interview I've ever had. And I knew as I walked away that John and I were probably going to be friends forever. And the obvious rejoinder is, well, who else would have us? And fair enough. But this became a meaningful day, right? When I got home, I had on my answering machine, to tell you how long ago this was, on the answering machine, there was a job offer. And I wrote to him and accepted it. And then he wrote back and he said, well, I'm thinking our dean, who everybody hates, should maybe have some help. And so I want to hire you as assistant dean. I said, done. And then a day or two later, he wrote back and he said, when I told the dean that I'd hired her an assistant dean, she said, just give him the job. So I got promoted twice before I even walked out my door, which is a pretty nice set of circumstances to be working with. But then I had to go to Iraq, and that's a little more daunting than you might think. And I don't mean that it was daunting because it was frightening. It really wasn't. But how on earth do you go from middle America? I was living near Pittsburgh right then. How do you go from Pittsburgh to a place populated by Iraqi Kurds. I knew almost nothing about Iraq. I knew nothing about Kurds. And I said, well, we'll figure it out. True American form, right? Let's wing it. So I had my family drive me up to the airport, and they were all teary at the time. And I had to walk in, and I had a Stratocaster with me. And I thought, this is going to be great. I'll play every day for a year. And the woman at the airport said, sir, you're going to have to check your weapon over there. I said, it's a guitar. She said, nope, check it over there. And it turns out it was for the best. I gave it up and sent it home with the wife, because I later found out that as you travel from the civilized world to Iraq, which in many respects is not civilized, they charge you more and more money every step you get. So I had 4 crisp $100 bills in my pocket. And by the time I got to Iraq, I was down to 2, because if I wanted my bags back, I'd have to pay some kind of bribe to get them. So there I am in Iraq. And then the first of 2 great lessons occurred. I had spent 26 to maybe 30 hours on the ground in Turkey, in Istanbul. I fumbled my way through that pretty badly. But by the time I got to Iraq, I was, as you might understand, very hungry. I thought, okay, I gotta go get some food. And because I was dean, I got there 6 weeks before everybody else. So there's no infrastructure in place to help me acclimate. And I figured, all right, let's go. And I took my 2 $100 bills and I walked out of the apartment, and I didn't know what cabs looked like. But I saw these cars that were painted exactly the same way. And I thought, well, that's probably got to be a cab. I called one over, and the guy spoke no English. I didn't know if that was always going to be the case. It wasn't. But in this case, it surely was. And I went like this. I said, I need food. And he went, ah. I got in, and he drove me to a restaurant. And I said, no. And then I pretended to have a bag. And he said, ah. And he drove me to a grocery store. It was just that easy. When I got to the grocery store, I said, wait here. And he went, indicating that he kind of understood. Then I went into the grocery store and I filled up a cart with food. And by the time I got to the register, I thought, oh, dollars, hundreds, no less. They're probably not going to take this. And I took a $100 bill out and went like this. And the woman just nodded her head, took it, handed it to a child who ran out the front door of the grocery store. I thought the worst. But he came back with a wad of dinar. Turns out they didn't have enough to make change for me. And they took what they needed, they gave me the rest, and I walked out. I got back in the cab, brought me back to the apartment, and I went like this with all of the money, probably $80 worth of dinar in my hands. And he very carefully took what he needed and sent me on my way. When I got to work the next day, I asked Agresto here if that was normal, and he said, actually, yes. You will never, there is no thieving here. You will never be mistreated. He said, you won't even be insulted. And that was by and large true. We were very safe and we were treated well. So what's that first lesson that I took away? Counter to what John said a little while ago, I think there's a prevailing wind going in the other direction. People really do share a common element, right? We call it human nature, and that might be a mistake. But there is something that unites us all deep down inside. And the more I learned about my Iraqi friends, the more I realized this was absolutely the case. That if you ask them, and they didn't have any pressure on them to answer in a certain way, in honest moments, they would all say exactly the same thing. I want to have a decent job, I want to take care of my family, and I want to be comfortable. How is that different from anything any of you want? That's what most of us want most of the time. So it should have been easy, you see, to build on that. We should have been able to look at that and say, sure, let's make a government, which we did, and we failed miserably for a lot of the reasons that John points out. But I'll go one step further than he would, at least today. When I got there, I started wandering about, and I was shocked at how well I was treated. I was shocked at how normal the place was, for lack of a better term. The amenities that we had were not the ones I would have expected. The amenities we did not have, I would have thought we would have plenty of. So it's shocking in its own way. And when you don't speak the language, actually you get tired at the end of the day. It's a lot to process day in and day out. So it was kind of rough living there for the first couple of weeks. But by about the beginning of week 3, so 20-ish days in, give or take, I looked around and I thought, okay, what have I learned? And the first thing that I figured out, absent those things that you learn on just getting by, like how do I go to the grocery store? The first important thing, the first important lesson I took was that liberal democracy, and you hesitate to use the word never, would probably never happen there. I'd be more than happy if it did, but probably never. And then you have to ask why. And here I think John's earlier observations are spot on. People don't consider themselves as individuals, not first. They do have a sense of the self, everyone does, but that's not the important political subdivision. The important political subdivision is the clan. Which clan are you from? And where do you sit in relation to all the other clans? And that was the important question. It was brutally difficult to answer. And as Americans, we didn't really have any understanding of how to deal with that, right? We walked into a university and we said, well, we're here to teach people, let's go do that. And people would walk into my office and they would give their family history before they would ask me a question. And I never could figure out why the hell that mattered. But oh God, did it ever matter? There were certain things that were just out of our hands and we could not do as educators. And the first thing we had to learn was this idea of clan history. Because what clan you were in determined how you would be treated and what would happen to you. And as we thought about that, I don't think that we ever came up with even a half decent response, because any response we would have come up with would have kind of missed the giant center of this amorphous thing that we had a lot of trouble understanding. So within 3 weeks, 20 or so days, I knew that we would never be able to establish a government there. And if you couldn't establish it up in Kurdistan where we were, you absolutely couldn't establish one down in Baghdad where everybody else was, because the Kurds were the closest thing to Americans I have ever seen abroad. They actually have this familiar idea that they matter, the same as all of you. But even they couldn't get away from this idea of a clan. So it was kind of heartbreaking more than anything else when you realize, yeah, I could educate them, but I can't educate them to the best, the highest things. Because the highest things in the liberal arts tradition really require that you understand the human being's place in the cosmos, right? You have to understand where the individual sits relative to everyone else. And the relationship here was confused by an extra layer, a layer that none of their professors understood nor could understand. And that's about how it is I think we failed. Do I think we failed overall? And now I'm not so sure, because we introduced certain things into the conversation there, things that I hope 20 years down the road will make a critical difference. The same way all of your professors hope that 20 years down the road, you will make a critical difference, right? That's not something for today, that's something for later. And as professors, we're all, I think, quite saddened by the fact that we don't get to see your greatest moments down the road. We just get to see you now. And so it was when I was there. I got to deal with the Iraqis that I got to deal with at that moment in time with what they had. And that was a real tough nut to crack. And to the extent that John looks back on the time and thinks, wow, that was difficult, I couldn't agree more. I think so too. Was it worth it? I don't know. And I won't be able to know in my lifetime. I hope it does prove to matter, but I don't know. And on that less pessimistic note, slightly less, I'm going to go over there and we'll take whatever questions you've got. I sense you probably have a few anyway.
Thank you. So we want to entertain some questions, and I think you could shout them out, and we'll let our guests select you from the audience, but I'm going to exercise my right to ask the first question. And I'm wondering if you, one or both of you, could share a story of a positive moment in which you felt you made a difference in the life of an individual there, or in the region, maybe on a larger scale.
Arab Iraq rather than Kurdish Iraq, because I went there in 2003, and we went there to get rid of Saddam, which we ultimately did. And the people flocked, young people, your age, flocked, a little older maybe, flocked to the coalition forces that were there. One guy named Ali wanted to become an American in the worst possible way. One day, and he worked for the people who fed us there, Kellogg, Brown and Root. And he was he spoke very good English. And we can talk about that in a minute, why so many Iraqis spoke English. But he came to me and he said, "Today I have become an American." I said, "How did you do that?" He said, "Because I have been watching the soldiers and the people at Kellogg, Brown and Root and you people here, and I know what it means to be an American. Today I saw a woman trying to get her little kids to nursery school, and she couldn't handle them, but I had my car. And so I said, get in the car and I'll take you to nursery school." And I did. And then after that, I saw a man with no legs begging on the street. So I gave him lots of money. Basically, I gave him all my money. He says, "Very nice. How do you do? How does that make you an American?" He says, "Because I'm following what you Americans do. I help people I don't know." That was telling to me, absolutely telling, and telling correctly. He actually died. He was killed by in a car bombing, targeting him because he was going to pick up his sister at the university that we helped her get into. And they knew what his route was and when he would go pick up his sister, and they shot him. The fanatics did. But he did die an American, at least in his soul. I also met I had people there as translators and drivers who, Hassan is in the book, that's not his real name. We finally got him out of Iraq. He and his wife were destined for death because the fanatics were after him. She actually started a women's magazine and a women's center, and he worked for the Americans. And he had been taught by Jesuit priests in what used to be called Baghdad College, which was a high school there. And it was staffed by Americans. And he said one day, and he spoke perfect English, and he said, Dr. John, do you know the first words that Macbeth says in the play?" I said, "No." I said, "No. I know what the witches say and how they." He says, his words are, so fair and foul a night I have not seen." That's the story of Iraq. How fair and foul this night is. Which way it'll go, we're not quite sure. He finally managed, he and his wife, to escape. If they hadn't escaped, they would be dead. There are hundreds of stories about that, about people, and Jim is actually right. There is such a thing as human nature, but there's also such a thing as culture. And I remember Pascal saying in something he wrote once that culture is our second nature. Not that it abandons nature or overcomes it, but it's a second nature. And how these two natures interact within us, I don't know. It's never clear when you look. I do think he's right about the Kurds, although I'm more pessimistic about Iraqis and he's more pessimistic about Kurdish Iraqis than I am. I really do think that they have the makings for the flowering of real liberal democracy there in their enclave. I just wish we support them better than we do.
We'll see about that, and I hope you're right. I really hope you're right. The best story I've got, and it's one of the best stories of my life, not just my time in Iraq. It was a weird situation. I was dean, yes, but I was expected to teach. So I taught one course a semester, and it was always American government. So I taught American government to our Iraqi Kurds in Sulaimaniyah, which doesn't make any sense at all if you know what any of those words mean. And I'm in there, and I think John actually came in to observe this very day. I was in teaching about the Declaration of Independence and how, again, the individual is the important political unit there. All men are created equal, and so on and so forth. And I'm talking about it, and I could tell people are understanding, they're nodding their heads, and it's not offensive to them in any way. And I wrap up, and we're ready to go, and a girl sitting in the front raised her hand, and she said, "But you haven't talked about the deleted indictment against King George III. In Thomas Jefferson's rough draft of the Declaration, he blamed slavery on the king. Can you talk about that, please?" And I looked at her and I said, "You are now my favorite." And a couple of guys in the class got offended that a girl could be favorite. And I looked at them and I said, "You boys best elevate your game because she is killing you at this point." And I talked to her a little bit outside and she said, "Thomas Jefferson is my hero." I said, "God, what are the odds?" She said, "I want to move to the United States." And I kind of laughed that off. And a bunch of years after I got back, I was writing letters on her behalf to get her over. And she was granted asylee status. She sought asylum and got it. And got her green card and the whole bit. She's now working on becoming a citizen. And if you think about it, how many of you knew that there was a deleted indictment in the Declaration of Independence written by Thomas Jefferson? And I'm guessing the answer is almost none of you, if not none of you. And that's fine. That's not the kind of thing you have to know. But she did. She did. And she got here. God bless her. Right? She was a better American than most Americans I've known. Barely a week goes by, I don't hear from her. And when I hear from her, it's always Jefferson, even now, 10 years later. It's a nice story, at least one that you can look back on and say, I did make some kind of a difference here. Anybody have any questions? Yeah. Better at this than I.
Microphone. It's interesting how we Americans talk about individualism, number one, the importance of number one. And at the same time, we talk about belonging, connecting, living for something higher than ourselves that we can be part of, whether it be as Iraqis might, the tribe, or as the Kurds might, the Kurdish people, or live life for an ideal, as maybe everyone from devout Christians to devout communists might live for an ideal. And all of this is important to us. It's not just jihadists. I think all of us want to be part. Yes, we have our own self-interest, and that's more or less apparent in each of us or known to us. We also want to be part of something bigger than ourselves. We all want to be important, and sometimes we can't be important on our own, but we can be important if we attach ourselves to something important that we can devote ourselves to. And that living life in that way, this is why I said to study the psychology of not just of extremism or fanaticism, but the psychology of human motivation. I know psychology talks about all kinds of things that don't seem to be terribly important, but there are things that are important that can only be known by studying human nature and our psychological bend towards otherness as well as towards ourselves. Remember the very beginning of Ken Burns' Civil War series. I don't know if you've ever saw that on television. He has Oliver Wendell Holmes Jr. saying, we were soldiers and we lived life at its peak. And it was that desire to live life at its peak, for either to fight for the freedom of slaves or to fight to defend the South. That was living life at its peak. Wasn't I lived my life for me. I lived my life at its peak, and that was being connected to the platoon, to the family, to the tribe, to the nation, to heaven. Those things are really motivating factors, not just selfishness or materialism or self-aggrandizement.
Right. And in our day-to-day lives, we kind of wave a lot of that off, right? We just get rid of it. We don't think about it so much. But ask yourselves this easy question. I'm going to give you a piece of paper that says I am at the top. And what are all the things you are? Because that list is going to be way longer than you think. And it's a complicated list. Some of those things are at cross purposes. So when we go to a place like Iraq and we expect them to react in a certain way, we didn't read their lists. And you kind of have to. And here's the kicker. As you age, your list gets really different. So when I was your age, I was more or less a pacifist. By the time I was 40 or so, I had had 3 children. And if somebody took the food out of their mouths, I was going to be anything but a pacifist. Matter of fact, I would have been a criminal, not to borrow the plot of Les Miserables, but I would have killed a person if my children were starving. And now that they're older, I'm a pacifist again. And there's not a disharmony there, right? These are just constituent elements of my soul. And everybody has multiple constituent parts. How you understand that, I don't know. That's really hard. I wouldn't send a bunch of psychologists into Iraq to build a college, right? And I don't know that we did any better. But at least we had a running shot, maybe. That's a great question. Thank you. Yeah. Yeah.
Do you guys think that the Kurds would be better off if their own country or if they're part of Iraq?
I'll repeat it. He asked if the Kurds would be better off if they had their own country. And I think the answer to that, at least for the Kurds, is an unqualified yes. When you look at that part of the world, you've got Iraq, Turkey, Syria, and Iran. And if you draw a circle around the Kurdish portion of each of those places, there's 35 million of them. They're the largest ethnic group without a state. And they sure as hell think of themselves as Kurds first and whatever they happen to be second. So I think you'd alleviate a lot of pressure. And this leads to one of the most bizarre things that happened, as far as I could really tell when I got there. The Kurds are hardly anti-Israel. They look at Israel as a blueprint for their own political fortunes, right? Why is that? Israel carved out a space to live among its enemies. And that's exactly what the Kurds aim to do. And whether they'll be successful or not, who knows? But yeah, they're way better off if they get the state than if not.
Yeah, the problem is, and I agree with everything James said, the problem is that the American State Department in particular never wanted the Kurds even to move in the direction of having their own state, because not unfairly, we thought the only hope for Iraq is if people with the Kurdish spirit and the Kurdish know-how and the Kurdish outlook could be part of Iraq itself. And we were willing, in a sense, to sacrifice the Kurds for the sake of all Iraq. Whether that's a smart sacrifice, I'm not sure it is. And the longer time goes on, I'm sure it's not. So I'm agreeing with James. It'd be very good if the Kurds could have their own country, even though there were geopolitical reasons why we didn't want it to happen. But somebody over here.
So I actually am in psychology. I'm a psychology major, and we learn about collectivism and individualism within different types of cultures. Even though the U.S. is considered more individualistic, we still have family backgrounds. We still have family top priorities. Is there a way to find a balance between individualism and group-like plans or collectivism? And is it possible to maybe bring a group of diverse people over there? Maybe you said you wouldn't want to bring a bunch of psychologists over there. I agree. I wouldn't either. But maybe like different types of groups of people with different types of backgrounds or majors or things that they want to go into. Would that be possible?
Would it be helpful if a lot of different kinds of people found their way over there?
Let me change the question a little bit, because I don't know the answer to that
Here's
question.
where you get hosed, right?
I don't know the answer to that question. Depends on who the people are and what types they are, I guess. The interesting thing, and to be honest, the thing that keeps even people of goodwill, let's take the educated Kurdish professional, from being totally on the side of American liberty, of America, is because he sees it as simply individualistic and not having enough respect for family, for culture, for religion, and you know, we say, well, let me put, how shall I put this nicely? They would look at contemporary American liberal ideology as something that, why would anybody want that? Now, not that they don't believe in women's liberation. They believe women are equal to men, at least the better ones there. But that women could at will have an abortion and kill, the fetus. That's horrible, horrible. Should there be some limits on that? I remember one professor at the Kurdish University we set up was telling them that the purpose of being educated is so that you could disobey your parents. Just so go to your father and say, you're wrong. We couldn't convince him that that's not what it means to be educated. And if that gets out to the Kurdish community that that's what we're teaching, forget about it. And he was teaching philosophy. He didn't know that prudence was a virtue. He didn't have a clue about this. So they see American individualism as simply not individualism, certainly not as rugged individualism, but a kind of hedonism, a kind of softness that we translate every passion we have, every desire we have, we call it a right, so that we can be, to be blunt about it, they can't understand our current infatuation with homosexuality, that's no way to have a family. That's no way to have a clan. And so they see the extremes of American liberalism as something that worries them. No, they have nothing against having your own thoughts, living your own life, making a lot of money. In fact, especially the Kurds love making money. And in fact, it's Middle Easterners are sort of natural merchants. Traders, bargainers, but how far we've gone to make every desire a right and to make every right absolute, it confounds them.
I'm going to actually answer your question because he didn't. But you admitted it, which makes it better. I remember talking to my students and religion came up and they knew that we could talk about that anytime they wanted. And they yelled at me for being a Christian missionary. And they were horrified to learn that I was neither Christian nor a missionary, right? And I said, look, you don't understand how an American looks at religion outside of certain portions of the Bible Belt in Utah. I don't know what religion any of my neighbors are. I have no idea. And that was unfathomable to them. They couldn't understand how that could possibly be true. And it gets kind of strange when you start realizing the way their lives are built. And you ask, I think, a great question. What's the context ultimately for a free, a prosperous, a thriving, maybe, or a flourishing life more than free? Because you can flourish even if you're not perfectly free. And there, I think the answer gets very, very strange. And I'm always going to say, roughly speaking, the same thing. You can be free in the aggregate without really being all that free in your own personal day-to-day life. Because how free are any of us really? Right? I mean, I have a family. I have to deal with all kinds of nonsense from those people. I can't just go do whatever I want. And they're kind of horrible in their direction of me, right? I have a job and I've got to do what those people want. I got to make a lot of people happy a lot of the time. Am I free? Well, kind of. And if you can say kinda to that question, you're doing better than a good number of people on this planet. So don't overlook it. Is it perfect? No, it's not. Nothing human is perfect. But it's kind of getting there, isn't it? And how can you capitalize on that in Iraq? And I think the only way to do that is to prevail upon people that these sorts of things, family, work, whatever things you have, they can't be absolute. They can only be a claim on your attention. Now, it may be a claim on the greater part, but if you get beyond it just being a claim and being an answered question, you've already lost. So that's how I would answer it, right? Human beings are complicated. You got to figure the complications right into your math, for lack of a term. And if you can do that, you can win. But it's very hard to do that.
Talk about the cheating story that you told me last night. Give us a sense of the culture of the cheating.
Yeah, he wants to. I told the story last night, and it involves Jim, as many stories do, and it goes something like this. Students worked very hard at the university we started, and they were really just lovely people. But there was a problem with cheating, and it has 2 points. This story. The first point is we'd catch students giving answers to other students, and we'd call them in and we'd say, "That's cheating." And they said, "Well, we don't call it that, but yes, I did that." Why did you give Ahmed the answers to the test? He said, "Because he's my cousin." I said, "Well, what the hell difference does that make? He's your cousin. You know it's against the rules of the university to cheat." He said, "Yes, but it's against the rules of my family not to help my cousin. If I went home and my father found out through his brother, my uncle, that I knew the answers and didn't give a hand to Ahmed, I would be punished. I would be beaten. He's my cousin. I have to help him. That's the rule. And if God finds out I didn't help my own cousin, he will punish me. So I know it's against the rules, but we all do it, and we're going to continue to do it." The other thing is when, here's where James comes in, James found out that while blackmail is a very bad thing, bribery in some places and some contexts isn't so bad. And so you would go out and you'd say, "Who needs a smoke? Want some cigarettes? What do you know about the cheating that's going on in the math class? Any idea who's doing it? Now, I know none of you are doing it, but here, do you know, have a cigarette? You want to take it over for you?"
It took literally 4 hours from that moment
To find out the whole cheating network at the university.
Yeah, it didn't take much at all. They were purchasable and they were cheap. Because cigarettes were costing $14 a carton in Iraq at the time. There's a smoker in here who just expressed shock. That's really, really cheap. And come to find out that the cheating was everywhere. It wasn't that some people cheated a lot. It was that literally everyone cheated a lot. And it's almost impossible to run a program like ours with that bedrock material. And it got so bad that you'd catch them and you'd eliminate one method and they'd move on to the next. And there was this game of brinksmanship going on at the end there. And I was actually, I don't think I ever even told you this, I was about to purchase a device that would shut down all cell phones within a certain radius. Because what they had figured out at the end was that there were these little tiny devices that would fit in their ear canal, not on the ear like you think of with earbuds, but way deep. And they're so small, you couldn't see them. And what they would do is they would just ask questions as if they were talking to themselves in the class where they took their exam, and their cousin would be outside the building with a book in his hand.
I didn't know this.
Yeah, and so I'm buying a cell phone killer, so they couldn't do that. And it turns out that that's about when I decided I was done and that it was time to come home.
But I have to say, the worst aspects of cheating were when the professor was selling answers to the exams for money, and that happened.
Yeah, no, any poor behavior that you might think professors engaged in, they did. And that's more problematic here than in most other schools, right?
Yeah.
There would be a self-correcting mechanism in an American university that would ferret that sort of thing out. And that didn't exist where we were.
I was the one who found out the professorial cheating.
I mean,
You were good with students.
Yeah, that's true. And there were a couple of professors that did a couple of terrible things. But,
Yeah.
you know, it was an open question whether we would catch them or not.
We don't want to stop, Liz.
I know. I mean, I think that last story indicates there might be a universal human nature.
Yeah, maybe.
I mean, so just a couple words and then we'll adjourn here. You know, this was a very sobering talk, and yes, there were some entertaining moments, but as the 20th anniversary of September 11th, maybe, you know, not every time is a time for celebration, and not every time is a time for being angry or happy or fighting. Maybe it's a time just to be a bit sober and to reflect and think about how we might move forward in a positive way and take these insights with us. So with that in mind, I'd really like you to join me in thanking our two guests for coming today.
Thanks, everybody. Thanks for coming out. Take care.